Buongiorno di nuovo a tutte e a tutti. Oggi mattinata molto ricca, sono sempre io, Massimo Leone, direttore del Centro per le Scienze Religiose della Fondazione Bruno Kessler, e abbiamo un secondo relatore di eccezione che abbiamo un po' catturato nei suoi passaggi, diciamo, da un continente all'altro. Si tratta di Philippe della University of Pennsylvania, ma in transizione verso la University, China Normal University a Shanghai. Lo presento in italiano, poi la conferenza avrà luogo in inglese. È stato titolare della cattedra di francese, professore di studi francesi e cinematografici presso l'Università della Pennsylvania, nonché distinguished professor presso la East China Normal University di Shanghai, appunto, dove ha ricevuto la chair, Chan Chair, che occuperà, diciamo, che sta occupando, che occuperà nei prossimi anni. È caporedattore di una rivista molto nota che è French Forum, che diciamo guida dal 2007 e ha pubblicato numerosi contributi su poesia, letteratura fantastica, cinema di genere, cinema d'autore. Ricordo per esempio le Famille de la Poésie, gli studi su Ponge, Léris, Chave, Dubuchet, presso l'Università de France nel 1999. Ricordo Ponge de Cinéma, su Ponge, Louis Malle dans tous les états, e poi soprattutto un libro che diciamo sicuramente non mancherà nelle nostre biblioteche, Le Giallo ou l'infancy de l'art, che è un libro uscita da Garnier 2025, dedicato al polar, diciamo, al giallo, ai generi che sono investigati da Philippe. Attualmente è in preparazione 2 nuovi progetti di libri, in cui, diciamo, intercetta anche alcuni degli interessi del nostro centro, perché si occupa della presenza del sovrannaturale nel cinema, della presenza dei fantasmi nel cinema, quindi tutto ciò che, diciamo, è immateriale, spirituale, anche inquietante, e di questo in parte ci viene a parlare anche oggi. I switch to English because today the talk that Philippe we're going to present to us is entitled Filmic Avatars of a Vampire Figure, Conservation and Transformation of the Wurdalak. You're, I think, the world expert on Wurdalak, and it's really a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining us and for stopping by in your intercontinental travels. Now we'll share the presentation, and the floor will be, of course, yours. Okay, you just press this to move forward.
Okay.
Or also the arrows.
Oh, the arrows, yeah. Right. Okay. Grazie mille, Massimo. Then I'm going to switch to English. And I want to say that I'm very grateful for the invitation. Very, very happy to be here. Always a pleasure to be in Italy. It's been quite a while. So I'm very happy to be back, and this is my first time in Trento. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm grateful for the invitation. So I'm going to speak. I don't know that I'm the word expert on the Wurdalak, but so it's a very specific form of vampirism, and hopefully this will maybe resonate with some of you in terms of your own research, concerns, and so on and so forth. So the title is Filmic Avatars of the Wurdalak. So I'm going to talk about cinema, cinema only, but I'm going to refer, especially at the beginning of my talk, to the literary origins of this figure of the Wurdalak, right? And so, just a sort of epigraph from Tolstoy, and you'll understand very quickly why I'm referencing Tolstoy here from Anna Karenina. And the quote is, it's the very beginning of Anna Karenina, of the novel. The quote, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." End of quote. And I'm going to start with the sort of the inventor, the originator of the Wurdalak, and he was actually a lesser-known elder cousin of, towering giant of Russian letters, Leo Tolstoy. Although he was himself an accomplished poet, cum novelist, cum dramatist, cum diplomat in his own right, and not to mention a polished polyglot. And so I'm speaking about Count Alexei Konstantinovich Tolstoy, 1817, 1875. Sorry, so that was the quote. Sorry, I need to get into the habit of moving forward with the slides. And so these are the two. So to the left, you have Leo, if I may call them by their first names, and then to the right, Alexei. Right? Okay. So Alexei to the right is the one that I'm interested in actually here, because he penned at the precocious age of 22. I think he was only 22 years of age. And also at a moment in time when vampire fiction in Western Europe, I'm leaving poetry aside here, we could talk a little bit about the vampire figure in poetry, but otherwise, vampire fiction in Western Europe was still mostly limited to the British progenitor of the genre, whom you might be familiar with, J.W. Polidori, who had written The Vampire with a Y instead of an I, published in 1819. And we might also mention at the time, some scattered elements in French texts. Vampires feature, for example, in Charles Naudier's Smara ou les démons de la nuit, published in 1821, or also by Charles Naudier, his Infernalia, 1822. And I'm thinking, and I will return to him soon, I'm thinking mostly of Prosper Mérimée and his La Guzla, which is probably a lesser known text by Mérimée today, better known for La Venus d'Île, Lokis, or his more realist texts like Carmen, Colomba. So La Guzla, 1821, right? But Alexei Tolstoy published a French-language Gothic novella titled The Family of the Vourdalak. Now it's very complicated. He wrote it in 1839, so it's a few years after La Guzla and Charles Naudier's text as well. So written in 1839, but published only posthumously after his death. First in Russian translation in 1884, and then much later, 1950, in the original French. So it's a very interesting publication, unusual publication history. Almost immediately thereafter, meaning after he wrote that text, the family of the novella, that's the family of the Wurdalak, A.K. Tolstoy committed to paper a sort of a prequel, not a sequel, but a prequel of sorts, also in French, titled Le Rendez-vous dans 300 ans, the reunion after 300 years in English. A couple of other stories in the vampiric vein followed, Upir, 1841, and Amena, 1846. Upir written in Russian, Amena written in French. And Amena being the only one of his supernatural tales to appear in his lifetime. And the other stories were published after his death, right? Okay. That said, the Wurdalak-centered piece, the family of the Wurdalak, definitely remains today the most striking and successful of the four stories, to the degree that it was at one point regularly anthologized. You could find that certainly in French, you could find that novella in anthologies of supernatural fiction, fantastic fiction, and so on. Now, what is the Wurdalak? Maybe you might ask. The Wurdalak is essentially a folkloric Slavic variant of the vampire figure, initially presenting the physical appearance of an uncouth, archaic patriarch that is far, of course, from the image of the suave or dashing seducer made popular by Bram Stoker's Dracula, and more importantly, perhaps, its innumerable cinematic incarnations. Right? while retaining the primary mechanism of vampiric contamination, the Vourdalak's specificity, more importantly, lies in the nature of his or her, usually his, but well, it depends, it varies quite a bit, the nature of his or her target or victim. Indeed, Serbian vampires only feed on their loved ones, that is, relatives, and by extension, individuals they cherish the most. In the words of the Marquis d'Urfé, Tolstoy incest narrator, I quote, "Although their habits are similar to vampires of other countries, Vourdalaks prefer to suck the blood of close relatives and friends who die and become vampires also. In Estonia and Herzegovina, entire villages may be composed of Vourdalak." Right? End quote. In that inaugural version, as in many of its filmic renditions, the grandson is thus old Gorka's prey of choice. The old Gorka is the patriarch who is the first to become a Wurdalak, and his grandson very often, or at least in the original story, and in some of the filmic adaptations, is the first prey, because the grandson is the one that the patriarch loves the most, right? So he's his prey of choice when he returns home as a Wurdalak. Unsurprisingly, the child, once corrupted, will chew on his mother, right? And so on and so forth, in a virtually endless and uncontrollable cycle. So a cycle of predation and affection, of fusion and contagion. As the very title of Tolstoy's story suggests, the family unit, right? Or rather, the reassessment of that family unit through entropic disintegration and possible reconfiguration, I will explain, and we will see examples thereon. The family unit or its metamorphosis, right? And again, it's very relevant to the question of transformation, right, and preservation, because as you will see with the Wurdalak, the family very often is preserved, but in a, of course, completely metamorphosed way. Right? So the family unit is therefore inevitably at the center of Wurdalak narratives. Right? My aim is therefore to focus on some of the cinematic renditions of the family of the Wurdalak in order to examine varied treatments of that motif, that is, the familial bond and structure as the primordial basis for social order, anthropologically speaking. And so the varied treatments cover a range from melancholy to grotesque, from period piece to modernization, from straightforward adaptation to experimental fragmentation, from social critique to political subtext, and all of that, of course, within a general frame of remediation, reappropriation, recontextualization. For Tolstoy's novellas nowadays too often neglected. Presumably nobody here has read that novella. Right? So it's strange that it's so at one point it was, as I explained, published posthumously, a long time after the author's death, and then it was at one point anthologized, and so and so kind of more or less widely read, and now it's completely neglected. But on the other hand, we have a number of screen adaptations of that story. Some of those adaptations are also, lesser known, I guess. So the novella has been multiply and diversely adapted to the small or big screen. So we're talking cinema, but also television, over the years, starting with, surprising or not surprisingly, I don't know, but starting with two Italian opuses. The first one is by an Italian director whom I like very much, Mario Bava, also somehow neglected a little bit, including in Italy, but has a cult following in the US in particular, in France at one point and so on. So the Mario Bava that I'm referring to here, the Mario Bava film I'm referring to, is actually a Gothic horror anthology film. It's called Black Sabbath in English. The original title in Italian is I tre volti della paura. No connection, as is very often the case between the English title and the original title. I tre volti della paura. And in that film, so it's an anthology film. You know, the way they used to make those films in 1960s, 1970s. So you have 2 or 3, 4 sometimes segments. The segment that I'm interested in here is Vourdalak. Interesting because in the title it's in the plural in Italian. So we'll see why we have the plural here, right? Okay. As opposed to the family of the or du Vourdalak, singular, right? Okay. All right. The film I tre volti della paura stars none other than Boris Karloff, right? In the role of the ogre-like patriarch, of course. This is very late in Boris Karloff's career. He was actually very ill at the time, but he kind of fits the role where he's a sort of very aging character, but at the same time a fearsome character, a frightening character. Unlike most classic bloodlust-driven variants, vampirism is portrayed by Bava as an act of not so much erotic as familial or filial love. Of course, we're more used to vampirism being linked to eroticism or sexuality and stuff, right? Here, it's a bit different. There's a little eroticism, but not. Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. I'm going back a little bit. So sorry. I should have illustrated. It happens all the time. But I just skipped the slides. But anyway, so here you have, the originator, you have the inaugural vampire story to your left, John Polidori, the vampire. Oops. Smara, well, je sais Smara, ou les démons de la nuit in French, Maxime Laudier, and Laguzna by Meribe to the right. Okay, this is the Tolstoy story, la famille du, single du Vourdalak, right? Fragment inédit des mémoires de l'inconnu. Unpublished fragments of the memoirs of an unknown character. Here you have the various collection in French, although Swiss publisher, of the various stories by Alexis Tolstoy related to the Wurdalak figure, and now you have the Mario Bava film, and you can see here, yeah, okay, and this is, so you have Boris Karloff to your left, right here. And I chose that particular screen capture because here you have a sort of a view of the entire, precisely, family, family members. And of course, the grandson is sitting in Boris Karloff's lap here. Okay. I don't know whether I should move or is it, well, we're going to get to that. Anyway, so Gorka, as I indicated earlier, elects or selects his grandson, Ivan, right, as his first victim, right, and in the dead of night, flees the family cottage with him on horseback and into the dense forest. This forest, okay, right. In a sequence that, in a sense, could be read, at least that's the way I read it, as a loose. I don't know whether Mario Bava actually had that reference in mind, but I wouldn't be surprised knowing him. I mean, it was very, very well versed in Gothic fiction and so on and so forth. So it could be read, I think, as if you. That's why I put the two pictures here side by side. You have here a sort of drawing of the Alconic. I'm going to explain in a second, but maybe you're familiar with that as well. So maybe what Mario Bava was after here was a loose reenactment of, or at least a variation of the Scandinavian Elking legend about a supernatural being, the eponymous king of the fairies or the elves, right? The Elking, assailing an infant, right? An infant child, riding with his father, right? And eventually causing his death, right? That figure, of course, was made very famous by Goethe, right? Famous Goethe poem, Elkönig, 1782, right? More somber, actually, indeed, I would say thanatonic in tone, and substituting children for adults. That's a switch I'm interested in here. We move to a child, substituting children for adults of the opposite sex as sprays. Next one. Yes. This again, two paintings illustrating that particular legend. So because we have that switch from an adult being a victim to a child being a victim, right? So there is perhaps, I think, a suspicion of pedophilia, I think we can say, if not rape, perceptible in particular in the last but one quatrain of the ballad by Goethe. Sorry, I have the English translation here, I don't have the original German. But, so I quote, "I love thee, thy beauty I covet and choose. Be willing, my darling, or force shall I use? Dear father, oh father, he seizes my arm. The Elking father has done me harm." In the Bava film, there is, of course, an even more disturbing conflation of the paternal, grand paternal, in this particular case, figure, and the menacing, destructive entity. But paradoxically, this is not synonymous with such modalities as let's say, an Oedipal conflict, or the collapse of a family, or say, with the mythical paradigm of Saturn or Kronos devouring his own son, as was strikingly depicted, of course, by Goya here, right? Indeed, the frail Ivan returns, if I may use that term, in one piece, right, from the beyond. He kneels outside the home in the icy cold nights, almost as a diminutive, let me see here, so this is kind of riding away with the child on his horse, and now to the left you have the child in the father's arm. But maybe you have another, yeah, that's better. Mama, ho freddo, right? That's what he's saying outside, begging his mother to open the door, right? So he's almost like, with his arm extended in front of him, almost as a diminutive, albeit of course treacherous, Christ-like figure, begging for his mother to open the door and let him in. Which of course the mother is only too eager to do. How can she resist her poor child's pleas? Even if it means, so she opened the door, but of course, even if it means killing her husband first, because her husband tries to reason with her and to stop her, right? When the mother finally flings the door open, she's met instead by the merciless, feral face of Gorka, the Boris Karloff character, who proceeds to vampirize her, perhaps in avoidance, I might suggest, of what would have been otherwise an explicitly and morbidly incestuous embrace, of course, between a mother and the living dead child, right? And yet, what the film eventually proposes, in a sense, is a new modus vivendi for the family through vampiric inbreeding or endogenous, again, incestuous contamination. It stays within the family, so to speak, right? Before bringing her back into the redefined family fold, so to speak, Gorka, in the company of his relatives, had made it clear to his daughter Sedenka, S-E-N-K-A, that's the name of the daughter, mention the name because we will return to her later on, Sedenka, the daughter, had eloped with Vladimir Dufay, who is the young nobleman. So he's the outsider. He's not part of the family. He just happens to run into the family, right? And he had fallen in love with her. And Gorka, Boriskarov, warns his daughter, quote, "No one can love you more than we do." Of course. Interesting, because it means that family love is a stronger bond than any other kind of love, including, personal, conjugal sexual love. Echoing multiple previous face-to-a-window shot typical Mario Bava, including one of Gorka glaring at Vladimir lying on his bed, the concluding triptych uses light, color, and window pane to unite. Here, yes, very striking. Almost like a painting, like a triptych, like a classic triptych. The three squares, rectangles, right? Three window panes, one face in each window pane. To the left, and then of course we have also Boriskarov / Gorka peering through the window pane on the right here. So we have that concluding triptych, using again typical Mario Bava shot, the color, the shot, the shadows, to unite the family members ontologically as well as cinematically within a single frame. It's a frame with frames within frame, right? We have three frames within so it's an over-framing effect, if you would say, right? In film scholarship, right? Because we have the frame that is a screen, and then inside we have the big window, and then we have the triptych with three window panes there, right? So as well as cinematically within a single over-frame in their respecting squares or rows, as they look on the newly reaffiliated Sedenka kissing Vladimir until her head slowly moves towards his jugular. Right? Okay. Bava's Wurdalak is thus not content with implementing, no matter, of course, how abnormally or monstrously in viewers' eyes, not content with implementing analogous restructuring of the original family unit. It also, and more radically, favors inclusion, integration, or incorporation, right, of an external, allogenic, exogenous element, namely the outsider, the foreigner, Vladimir Dufay, into the familial matrix. So we really have a reconfigured family unit incorporating an external element. The second Italian adaptation, in a contemporary setting this time, is Giorgio Ferroni's, so this time the English title is literal, The Night of the Devils, La notte dei diavoli. And I will return to this adaptation very soon. I'm mentioning other, so this is Spanish, The Fifth Horseman, El Quinto Jinete, but I just want to move fairly quickly, otherwise it's going to be a bit too long. These were followed by 2 or 3 decades later by a couple of experimental, believe it or not, Soviet films. Not too long before the fall of the Soviet Union, and that's, I think, important. We will return. I will return towards the end of my presentation to these two examples, Russian or Soviet examples. The first one by Klimov and Shavlak, the family. Of course, I will spare you. My Russian is non-existent, so I will spare you the original titles. But I think it's a literal translation of the original title. Quite simply, the family of the Vourdalaks. Again, see the plural that is being reintegrated here again. This is 1990. And we have another one, 1991, following year, by Yufit, more important, better known, at least in Russia, or the people interested in Russian film, because he was linked to a movement, I will return to that, called necro-realism, not neo-realism, but necro-realism. Right? And so the title in English is something like Daddy Father Frost is dead, right? Father Frost, I think, being sort of a variation of Father Christmas, in British English, Santa Claus in American English. And more recently, we have another Russian film, which I haven't checked out yet, but I'm not, based on the poster, I'm not exactly holding my breath, and I'm not sure that this is going to be a good one. And this one I have seen, it's an Argentinian film. It's forgettable, to use a euphemism, not very interesting, called, so what is it? I think it's Famille du Vourdalak in Spanish. Right? Last but not least, a very recent 2023 French version, finally, was brought to the screen by Adrien Beau, under the title simply of Le Wurdalak, and I will return to that film in a moment as well. Owing to the deferred, as I explained, publication of A.K. Tolstoy's novella, the introduction and popularization of the word Wurdalak as a distortion of the more common, but again, I'm not an expert in this, so I'm just, I read it, Wurdalak, in Russian, meaning wolf fur or wolf hide. Very interesting, because again, the werewolf perhaps is there as well somewhere, right? So the introduction of that word, Wurdalak, into Russian language is in fact generally attributed to, but I guess in Russia everything is attributed to Pushkin, to Alexander Pushkin, on the basis of an eponymous poem that Pushkin published in 1835 as part of the songs of the Western Slavs. That was a sort of a cycle, right, of songs, which actually happened, this particular poem, which refers to the Wurdalak in Pushkin, is actually a translated ballad alongside 10 others from the previously mentioned La Guzla by Mérimée, where Mérimée refers to a brucolak, sort of a Frenchifying, presumably a word of Greek origin, and that word is rendered by Pushkin in Russian by Wurdalak. To complicate matters, this is a time where there was a lot of ludic activity with literature, right? And fake fiction and so on and so forth. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I've written about this, extensively. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but to complicate matters, anyway, purportedly a selection of Illyrian poems. In French, of course, it's illyrique, right? Lyric, which works a little bit better than the English translation, but a selection of Illyrian poems collected in Dalmatia, Bosnia, Croatia, Herzegovina. The Guzla eventually turned out to be one of the most famous, probably, literary hoaxes in 19th century fiction. Okay. So in other words, Mérimée pretended to have presented just translation of original poems, songs, and ballads and so on, when in fact it was completely fake, right? He wrote all of those poems and songs. So what was presented as mere translation work, again, full ballad, narrated or sung by a bard or guzlar, right? To the accompaniment of his ballad, string instrument or guzla, right? Completes, if you read La Guzla, there's a critical, erudite apparatus, footnotes, and so on and so forth, right? Introductory notes, but it was soon revealed as Mérimées' own invention and creation. It's interesting because, in a sense, with La Famille du Vourdalak, A.K. Tolstoy effected a looping of the loop, in a sense, or a vampiric looping of the linguistic and literary loop. That is, since, a bit complicated, but since under the influence of Pushkin, he turned to the French language, the better to reappropriate a Russian adaptation of an exoticizing Gallic mystification under the guise of a translation of Slavic folk tales. But it's all fascinating to me because it's a vampiric process par excellence, right? So it's vampiric fictional process at work here, right? A specific piece that might have acted as a sort of inspiration is arguably Pushkin's adaptation of Konstantin Yakubovich from the Merry collection. Oh, it's a bit small here, but I don't know whether you can read, but anyway, it's not that important. But in that particular, so this is an English translation of it. In that particular piece, in that particular ballad, a child is the principal focus of vampirization and the bipolarity of inside meaning a remote rural community with local values and presumably a primitive belief system or worldview. So that's inside versus outside. Outside in this instance, as in many classic Gothic tales, Western Europe is the outside as the stereotypical epitome of rationality, urbanization, civilization. Western Europe, and in particular Great Britain, England at the time. So that tension, that dichotomy between inside and outside is accentuated. If those two elements will constitute a constant amongst the screen adaptations of Tolstoy's novella, the peculiarity of the Medine Pushkin piece lies in the fact that instead of emerging from within, the threat permeating a peaceful nuclear family, here reduced to its minimal configuration, the parents and their only child, comes from a wicked stranger, a méchant étranger. That wicked stranger is qualified as a Greek schismatic who asks to be buried in a Roman cemetery. But he's Greek, right? In a Roman cemetery. And of course, there follows his metamorphosis into a fearsome vampire. In the most recent cinematic avatar of the Tolstoy story, Adrien Beau's Le Vourdalak, the French version, the local family's elder son, Yegor, unfairly accuses Marquis d'Urfé, the French diplomat, who has wandered off into a secluded village of Eastern Europe, of having brought misery upon his family, before hitting him and tying him up to a pillar in a cellar. In an inversely symmetrical fashion, the film will end on Sudenka's, the daughter of the family, and that's, of course, not in the original material, not in the original novel, Sudenka's flight to France upon the vampire-bitten Marquis's encouragement before his self-inflicted death, because he knows that he's been turned into a vampire, he's been contaminated. And that's the ending of the film. When Sudenka arrives in France, a duchess provides shelter to this oddity of a stranger, and the duchess writes in her memoirs that Sudenka looks like lost and pale as a ghost. And she ushers her in, or rather, Sudenka is ushered in by her chambermaid in the middle of the night. Interesting, because the revenge of Eastern Europe peasantry upon French nobility, the French duchess, is implicitly in place since a fleeting telltale sign had alerted the attentive viewer at the very last moment, but you have to be really attentive, that Sudenka, far from having miraculously, or at least inexplicably, escaped the vampiric curse, she has instead turned into a Wurdalak herself. Because, and that's where you have to be very careful, when she rides away on horseback in the epilogue, she is seen munching, as you can see to the right, on a piece of cloth in true Wurdalak fashion. And we will return to this, but this is again not in the original novella, but this is in Adrien Beau's film, right? Those who have been turned into Wurdalaks have the habit also of munching on a piece of and salivating on a piece of cloth. So we know that, so in other words, the French nobleman, the French aristocrat, knows that he has been bitten, he's going to become a vampire, okay? So to avoid that fate, he decides to fall off the cliff, okay? But he thinks, mistakenly, that Sedenka has not been contaminated. And so he says, go to France, it'll be a better life for you. So you see how the inversion, so that Eastern Europe is now going to contaminate, French aristocracy and so forth, right? Okay. It's a 2023 film. I think there's a little bit of a reverse colonization thing going on there, but it's totally implicit. Interesting or surprising enough, it's very implicit in the film, but I think it's there. But I want to go back in time and to that second Italian screen adaptation that I mentioned earlier, La notte dei diavoli by Ferroni. Again, in a modern, that's coming up, sorry, coming later. In a modern day setting, that is, the film came out in the early 1970s, and same time frame for the diegetic setting. So the film, the Ferroni film also stresses this opposition between inside versus outside. We have a forestiero, a stranger or intruder, and his name is Nicola. Okay, and he's found refuge at a farmhouse located near the Slovenian border. Interesting also that we have this sort of liminal space between Italy and Slovenia, right? The woodland villagers are perceived as not just, sorry, I'm quoting from the English subtitles here, but they're kind of, I think they're pretty faithful. Strange, so the villagers are perceived as strange, totally ignorant and hard-headed, right? But also frightened witless by all the local crazy legends and fairy tales. This is the word, in the words of a sawmill owner or a character. After all, Sedenka, played by Agustina Belli, Sedenka herself had readily admitted, oddly enough, right before declaring her love to the protagonist, that, I quote, we're simple, countrified, uneducated people. In this particular instance, I think the subtitles are a bit off, but I'm trying to check. No, I don't have the original Italian. It's not as so exaggerated in the Italian original language. Although again, with that type of film, you don't really know. I mean, what the original language is. As you probably know, in the Italian film industry, in particular genre film industry, 1960s, 1970s, a lot of those films were meant for an international market. So very often, those films were shot with no sound, no live sound at all, and then was dubbed in post-production, right? Or English was a sort of a lingua franca, right? And so all of the actors, even if they were Italians, anyway, those films were all often co-productions. So all kinds of nationalities amongst the cast, but they would all speak their lines in English, right? And then again, you had dubbed versions or subtitled versions and so on for this or that market outside of Italy. Even more interesting in La notte dei diavoli is the introduction of a character that not only is completely absent from the source material, but again highlights the us versus them dichotomy, while providing a rare, if somewhat muddled definition of a Wurdalak, a term that is barely even mentioned, really, in some of the films, not only this film, but other films that I'm discussing today. Of all places, Nicola meets former Brigadiere Kovacic in a Catholic church, where the latter, the Kovacic, likes to play the organ in his free time. Right? Kovacic was fired from the police force, he explains, quote, for being too superstitious for practicing exorcism. And he adds in a continued analogy, quote, "They got rid of me the same way they did with witches in the old days." Unquote. And indeed, the unnamed witch, and she doesn't have a name in the film, is another idiosyncratic addition, here really perhaps echoing the Mashara character in Lucio Fulci's rural giallo. I don't know whether you're familiar with that film, Non si serizia un paperino. Don't torture a duckling, kind of good translation in English. A film released in 1972, right? So to the left, what you can barely see here, it's a screen grab from the Ferroni film, and to the right, a Fulci film. So again, it's a sort of a skeleton of a very small baby. So again, here, to the left, it's basically the witch in Ferroni's film digging up. It's actually not a skeleton; it's actually a wood sculpture, a tiny wood sculpture from the soil, from the ground. Okay, and in the Lucio Fulci film, the local Mashara, right? The witch completes a similar action with a baby skeleton. Okay, this is right from the start of the film. And so again, what we find in Ferroni's film is perhaps a displacement of the patriarchal trope inherent to the Wurdalak narrative, since the witch is portrayed as the sole or primary and primal source of evil in the film. As a result, Gorka, so the patriarch again, Gorka's only fault, albeit a cardinal failure as pater familias, lies of his own omission in his inability to protect his family from the curse somehow visiting upon them by the bloodthirsty old witch. In her ferocious showdown with Gorka, which is largely left off screen so as to sustain doubt about the outcome, the witch, on top of her otherworldly or zombie-like physical attributes, she has a wan complexion, she has red circles under her eyes, she has that maniacal laughter, she wears dark clothes and so on and so forth. She wields, as you can see to the left here, a bull's horn against her opponent's invading stake, making pretty explicit her phallic woman, right, status, or her formidable castrating power, right? Now, whether this is a perpetuation of a misogynistic trope or a reflection of masculinist anxiety vis-a-vis the rise of rural feminism, in the 1970s, with the witch as a conduit, if you will, for a liberating force, wreaking havoc with patriarchal society. Whether it's one or the other, that remains, of course, a matter of interpretation. As a matter of fact, Ferroni's film generally tends to turn the tables on the original novella in terms of gender dynamic, since the boy in the peasant family is substituted by two young girls, Irina and Mira, two young girls first seen to the left here, huddled together with their doll at a window. At once seemingly frightened and subtly spooky. Right? And yet you have the older brothers to the right, and again, sort of copying Mario Bava's window shot there, right? Or face to window shot, right? Okay. And yet, little Irina, the one to the left, the left-hand side girl in the left-hand side screen capture here. Little Irina, once vampirized, she will be vampirized, will turn savagely on her own progenitor, most tellingly after dropping her doll to the ground. It's interesting because it's a doll that she had previously cradled and comforted and protected, pretending that it was sick, that the doll was sick, in an almost true maternal fashion. And so she was behaving like a mother to her doll. And yet, once she's vampirized, not content with biting her mother's neck, here, to the left, I mean, you don't see the mother's neck, but she has just bitten her mother's neck. It was blood dripping from her mouth. So not content with biting her mother's neck, she proceeds to rip her blouse to the right so as to expose her breasts, which she then gnashes with her fingernails with cruel relish. Of course, there's quite a bit of exploitative stuff going on here. This is 1970s. Siblings Irina and Mira will later laugh mockingly and hysterically during Nicola's ordeal, Nicola the protagonist, ordeal at the hand of the rest of the now Vourdalakized, if I may venture such a neologism, the now Vourdalakized family, as he desperately tries to fend off their assaults. In the tragically ironic twist of the epilogue, which returns us to a framed narrative completely again different from the one in the original novella, since it features an agitated, possibly deranged Nicola confined to a mental asylum ward, Sedenka, unlike what occurs again in the source material and most of the filmic avatars, Sedenka is wrongly perceived as a threat or as an agent or Wurdalakesque infection. Instead of melting or caving in, as was the case with all of the previously impaled vampires, her face, so you see here that the protagonist, Nicola, is in this asylum, and he's gone presumably mad. We're not really sure, gone mad because of all the events that he has witnessed, and so on and so forth. And then Sedenka here, Agustina Bailey to the left, with her back to us, and wearing this sort of shiny black leather coat. She comes to the husband of the asylum, and she tries to plead with Nicola and says, come with me, I love you, blah, 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 blah. And he's convinced that she has turned into a Wurdalak, right? So that he impales her, and yet when she dies, well, I don't have a screenshot for that, but her face remains, of course, Agustina Bailey, she remains beautifully intact as she lies lifeless on the floor after a frantic Nicola has pierced her heart with a rod. Needless to say, Ferroni and his scriptwriters have been deliberately and somewhat heavy-handedly striving to hoodwink their audience as well, since a number of signs, Sedenka's fixed stare, for example, her altered voice, her suspiciously overeager vows of eternal love, just as earlier the coldness of her body or the blood on her hand seem to invalidate the possibility of her being the sole uncontaminated survivor in the family, especially when the only explanation Sedenka had to offer was, I quote, maybe they love me less than the others. Right? To return to Kovadic's parsing of the Vourdalaks, introduced as we have seen by reference to a witch hunt. Okay? It's interesting to note that the former Brigadier resorts to oxymoron. Of course, oxymoron is a canonical rhetorical figure in the fantastic genre as it transgresses boundaries or fuses opposites, living death. When Kovadic goes on to define those Vourdalaks as, quote, incorporeal material creatures. Incorporeal material creatures. Right? And he adds something like the notes of this music. Remember, he's playing the organ? And the continuation of his exposition blends the concrete and the abstract, the ontological and the metaphysical. Quote, and that's what he says, Kovadic. It's the terror of silence. Again, it's English translation. It's the terror of silence on which they feed, the terror of solitude. They kill for love, for companionship, in order to have near them the people they love the most. And their victims search for their own company, a never-ending chain of death until it's broken. Eros, Thanatos, and Melancholia, all rolled into one, so to speak. But of course, such a lofty context or heady brew seems somewhat at odds with the overall tenor of the film, even more so as you have seen in some of those screen captures, the gore factor, right? And to say nothing of the generally stilted performances and mediocre dialogues. As well as with the family dynamics, of course, that traditionally underpins, as previously mentioned, the Wurdalak paradigm. Okay. Let's see. I mean, Giorgio Ferroni is an interesting, was an interesting filmmaker. If you have a chance to see, what is the Il Mulino anyway, delle donne di pietra, I think, which is a very interesting early 1960s Gothic film. Anyway. Okay, so that would be another presentation. In its own way, the most recent avatar, Adrien Beau's Le Vourdalak, includes a vivid encapsulation of what appears to be at stake here as part of another instance of fairly detailed background information, courtesy of Sedenka and her brother Piotr, geared to educate or enlighten an unbelieving Marquis d'Urfé and the viewers, I guess, in the process. And Piotr says, in our neck of the woods, love itself is a curse. Love itself is a curse, right? And Piotr asserts that almost factually, albeit resignedly. His sister, Sedenka, supplies further details about the Wurdalaks that are a complete novelty again compared to the Ur text, and potentially takes the onto-metaphysical direction, the dimension of the Night of the Devils, into a more psychoanalytical direction or substratum. She says, quote, in order to soak up their drooling saliva, they developed the habit of chewing, as I mentioned previously, on their burial shroud, or piece of cloth, right? As we have seen previously here, Sedenka to the right, and another female character earlier in the film to the left. Hence, a deceptively infantile or regressive demeanor with its attachment to what I would call a transition, in a Winnicottian psychoanalytical sense, an attachment to a transitional object, right? This piece of shroud or cloth, that arguably, I would say again in a very psychoanalytical sense, that metaphorizes the maternal breast, in a sense, chewing, sucking on almost like on the maternal breast. Or perhaps in an even more primal, foundational fashion, that metaphorizes the mother of all mothers, right? The biblical Eve, right? Obliquely referenced early on in the film, when in the midst of a presumably primeval forest, the Marquis bites off a fallen apple to find inside it a worm, as you can see to the left, that Sedenka proceeds to pick up and swallow. Interesting. So again, it's very elusive, very oblique, very indirect, but I think we have several elements here that drives us in that direction. Adrien Beau's film is overall characterized by an assumed artificiality that translates into a fairly high degree of theatricality and wordiness, in particular in terms of acting and dialogue. And maybe that's some negative side to the film. Otherwise, the film also walks a fine line between the grotesque and the poetic or the romantic, as is exemplified by the bold choice of live-action puppetry to impersonate Gorka, the arch Wurdalak. As you can see to the left, that's from the Adrien Beau's film. So the Nosferatu, I guess, inspired, or perhaps more specifically the Crypt Keeper inspired, to refer to the right, to refer to the wisecracking puppet, a host and narrator on the Tales from the Crypt, HBO series, very famous at the time in the 1990s. So anyway, this skeleton-like marionette, right, was created and operated by the director, Adrien Beau himself, who also lent his own voice to the character. So it's quite a bit of a personal investment from the part of the, a bit like, I don't know, Dario Argento always saying that, in the stabbing murder sequences, it's his hand and his arm because no one else can do it as well as he does, right? So interesting power here, I think. But anyway, let's see. Particularly revealing in that respect is a slight alteration of an original scene from Tolstoy's short story, where in his sleep, Dufay imagines Gorka stealthily entering his bedroom at night, and I'm quoting from the original Tolstoy text here, bending over me, his livid face so close to mine that I could feel his corpse-like breath. And then, of course, Dufay wakes up to realize that the old man is in fact peeking in through the window. Right? In Beau's adaptation, there's closer intimacy, so to speak, right? And it's interesting here, in particular in psychological terms. The Marquis wakes up, or dreams of waking up. We're not completely sure whether he's dreaming or whether he's really waking up, to find in horror that Gorka is lying in bed alongside him, right here, right? Shortly after this sequence, Vlad's mother will share with him a horrifying nightmare of her own. And the nightmare is that she is looking for her son at night, and she only finds an empty, blood-soaked bed in his room filled with a pungent stench and a repulsive munching sound. Right? Since this is a plain foreshadowing, the nightmare, the mother's nightmare, the plain foreshadowing of the poor child's fate at the hands of his grandfather, again, the grandfather and the grandson. One may well surmise that Dufay's nocturnal vision here, whether against reality or nightmare or dream, maybe this scene was equally, albeit obliquely, prophetic, or in narratological terms, proleptic, right? Especially if one considers the protagonist's final return at nightfall, so towards the end of the film, he returns to the family household, where he finds a surprisingly impassioned Sedenka. The pair, Sedenka and the main protagonist, ends up in bed, right? They start making love, but in mid-coitus, the unfortunate Frenchman discovers in a mirror to the left here, I don't know whether you can see that you have the two candles, upright candles on each side, it's actually a mirror, right? The rectangle in the center, right? So he's making love to Sedenka, he turns his head slightly to the mirror, okay? And he sees that in actuality he's making love to a corpse, right? A corpse that is none other than the skeletal Gorka, not Sedenka, right? Relishing the copious amount of blood dripping from his mouth with a characteristic taunt, I quote, Monseigneur has an exquisite taste. This, of course, only fits within a larger frame of gender obfuscation throughout the film, with Dufay as a really effete, feminized royal courtier from France. He wears, as you have seen before, he wears a wig, his face is plastered with chalky white powder, and his cheek with rouge, right? Not to mention the customary adornment of a, what's the term for that? A mouche. You know, so it's like a... or tartapatch. Right? Also, there's Piotr, who is initially and repeatedly perceived as a cross-gender, I guess we would say nowadays, a gender fluid or gender non-conforming or non-binary character. Dufay actually first mistakes him for a woman, okay? And Gorka, Piotr's own father, later calls him fillette, girly or sissy, as we would say in English, right? Okay. It nevertheless remains unclear whether the Marquis has indeed made love to a shape-shifting Gorka. Maybe it's Gorka, but impersonating Sedenka, the better to lure and empowers Dufay. Gorka, who even once impaled on his couch, continues to play the role until Dufay sets the bed ablaze, on fire, and Gorka slash Sedenka's professed love turns into a curse. On the other hand, it could not have been the true Sedenka in bed. She could not have been burned to a cinder because, as we have seen previously, she is present in the film's epilogue. Although who knows, because of course, this changing metamorphosis process is of course confusing. And this type of confusion or incoherence might very well be attributable to a sometimes less than consistent script in Adrien Beau's film, a shortcoming that a black and white experimental film like Yufit's Daddy Father Frost is Dead can hardly be blamed for, if only because in that film we have minimal dialogue. The dialogue really is reduced to monosyllables or broken sentences, reduced to a non-existent soundtrack, almost no music. We have in that film long static shots. And more important in that film is the oniric, hallucinatory, and elliptical treatment of the same literary material. So all of that, of course, all of those features necessarily sidestep or subvert the main tenets of narrative logic. So this is really sort of a more experimental avant-garde kind of film. All this despite the fact that in addition to the two films, Beau's films and Yufit's films being debut features, both films are debut features for the two respective directors, despite the fact that a motif extraneous to the source material ultimately ties one film to the other. Of course, it's me doing the time. I mean, it couldn't have been deliberate on Adrien Beau's part, for example. And that link is the shroud. Again, the shroud. Right? In the French version, as you remember, the burial shroud, the Vourdalaks infantilely chomp on that burial shroud. In the Soviet film, shroud bindings are seen here. Shroud bindings which the victims, infected or not, are mummy-like wrapped in, right? And some of those bindings or wrappings, once loosened, are eventually blown away. To the right, you can barely see here. Those are tree trunks. And so those white shroud bindings are eventually blown away and surreally caught in the tree branches. Of course, addressing the details of this fascinatingly rich and complex film made by Yufit. Again, Yufit was a Russian filmmaker, photographer, and painter with a streak of the prankster and the exhibitionist in him, at least early on in his career. Of course, going into all the details would require a separate lecture in view of all its mesmerizing visuals and arresting, oftentimes poetical moments, especially but not exclusively around the figure of the child, which I will return to. So, by way of illustration, I could mention the following examples in terms of, again, this mix of poetry, of the hypnotic visuals, the elliptic a reappropriation of some elements. So just a few quick examples here. We have the patriarch here to the left returning home with an unusual present for his grandchild. So you see again the window motif here to the left, and I don't have time to go into all the details here, but this is a very odd present. It looks like a bottle inside some clay cover, and there are, as you can see here, perhaps matches planted into the clay surrounding the bottle here. Another, you can barely see here, which is too bad. But again, it's not a good print that I made the screen captures from. To the left, the child is now dead and is lying under wetland grassing, whispering, "Grandpa, kiss me again." And he's then to the right. He's then buried. So again, all of this stuff is not in the source material. Is buried inside a cavity, inside what is, I don't know whether you can figure it out here. It's a huge pile of wood logs, right? And so the child is buried inside a cavity in the pile of logs, on top of the logs, as you can see here, lies the cadaverous Wurdalak patriarch, lying with his rifle by his side. But equally incongruous, absurd, or surreal scenes generally abound, like the mystical ramblings about the unknown, uttered by a dentist consulted by the protagonist for a toothache, who proceeds to stuff his patient's mouth full with cotton before walking away and leaving the protagonist at the mercy of, are they vampires, Wurdalaks? Are they zombies? One of them, to the right, is using Morse code to communicate via telegraphy, without the purport of the message or its addressee being known. The film, however, along with Yufit's entire oeuvre, need to be reinscribed within that movement that I mentioned earlier, necro-realism, a movement that lasted from the early 1980s to the mid-1990s and was primarily concerned with death and decay within a context of black humor and absurdism. It was also, that movement, an integral part of the development of Soviet parallel cinema, right? Which basically meant, in the Soviet Union at the time, making film and distributing films outside of the official Goskino state cinema system in the 1980s, even with the perestroika and glasnost policies gradually loosening censorship. A critic aptly summarized the necro-realist ethos as, I quote, the exploration of the liminal state between life and death in which crazed zombies or necro-denizens wander apocalyptic landscapes and commit acts of wanton cruelty, homosexual violence, and murder, unquote. All of which features are, to a greater or lesser extent, present in Yufit's film, that Father Frost is Dead. Although necro-realism is not to be viewed as a strict or systematic parody of socialist realism, right? It is, to some degree, but not systematically. Right? So although necro-realism is not to be viewed as a strict or systematic parody of socialist realism, it would be difficult not to perceive a more or less explicit political or ideological subtext in this film, in a film whose only extensive verbal sequence is it's a disembodied voice, presumably coming from a transistor radio, or perhaps it's a subliminal form of propaganda, right? So a disembodied voice discoursing on how, I quote, moles do much damage into the country, right, unquote. How, another quote, one mole family is capable to destroy a significant amount of crop in the shortest time, and how consequently, quote again, the struggle with moles is our main tasks, right? Talpa, right? In Italian, talpa. So, of course, it works in French, it works in Italian, it works in many languages. I cannot believe it wouldn't work in Russian as well. A mole, the animal, but of course a mole, a spy, right? So, of course, I think the most obvious allegorical reading has to be a mise en abîme of the narrative proper. In other words, one might posit a sort of basic, almost mathematical-like equality or identity. Mole equals Vourdalak equals dissident or opponent or adversary of the state. All terms must be eradicated following, that is explained in the film, not explained, but presented in the film, fragments. All terms must be eradicated following the example of the mysterious chemical agent F-17, again mentioned in voiceover, developed to exterminate moles as, quote, enemies of agriculture. Enemies of agriculture, end quote. Or another quote, application of this chemical agent F-17, application of it guarantees the death of a rodent in 10 minutes. Or consider much later in the film a scene seemingly disconnected with the rest of the plot, or from the rest of the plot, with the already mentioned Wurdalak communicating in Morse code, and he's joined by one of his equally sinister-looking fellow creatures, zombie Wurdalak, whereupon both decide to empty, with no explanation, empty a wooden cabinet of its contents, archival documents, a raincoat, a briefcase. They proceed also to dismantle the shelves and to knock the cabinet over. They next pour a pot full of boiling water, or is it Agent F-17, over the face of a man. I guess I don't have. Oh yeah, yes. Sorry, I skipped. So this is. He's sort of almost sleeping. Is he dreaming? Is he hallucinating? He's listening to this subliminal propaganda. Moles do much damage to the country. That's the protagonist. And then those two zombies pouring water on another unknown character, here lying on the floor, and now, of course, writhing in pain. Seemingly aberrant in terms of internal logic, as well as relevance to the rest of the plot, this section does not, and this is not a coincidence, does not follow up on the capture of the protagonist by a group of zombie-like Wurdalaks who are inexplicably content with swathing his head with gauze and pulling his pants down. Again, to summarize, coded communication, ransacking, humiliation, torture, execution, actions and methods somehow obliquely evocative of operations conducted and crimes perpetrated by the KGB or related secret police state agencies in the Soviet era. These are but localized examples in a film that, to begin with, literally immerses us in some sort of dystopian. I was happy to see that there's a bookstore next door, across the street, called Ubik. So the dystopia is there. In some sort of dystopian, almost post-apocalyptic, subterranean, cutthroat, or survival type environment right from the outset. So, opening sequence. In what looks like a sewer or flooded underground tunnel, the film opens on a man wading through the murky water until he trips and his head gets caught in a hanging wire noose, killing him almost instantly. A one-legged man on crutches and a young boy quickly approach and proceed to steal the dead man's watch and to strip him of his clothes before carting him away and disposing of his body down fuming water. Again, it's all, it's not very clear. We're not really seeing fully and clearly where this is happening, what is exactly happening. A fresh identical trap is then set for the next victim. This is next implied by virtue of a camera cut to him waking up to have been, again, presumably, possibly, only a disturbing nightmare experienced by a biologist who we learn is about to leave to the countryside in order to complete a study, not of a mole, but of a shrew mouse. Whatever a shrew mouse is, it's a rodent, right? While visiting his cousin's family. Dream or reality, a dismal mood of existential dread has thus already been established, and the protagonist will soon be walking into an open-air, rural dystopia and a waking nightmare instead, yet equally grim and oppressive, nonsensical and violent, as if in a sense, the dreamed dystopia had overflowed into real life to the point of honorizing it. I'm thinking in different contexts of Nerval's Aurelia, with the dream that overflows into reality. L'épanchement du soul dans la vie réelle. No comforting closure will be provided in or by the final scene. Far from returning us to the prologue and possibly putting a definite end to the nightmare, those final frames plunge the viewer even deeper in it through fragmentation and ellipsis, suicide of a young boy on the rail tracks in front of an oncoming locomotive, a train, shots of the stake, and a photo of a shrew mouse floating down the river. In the coda, a silent film style title card announcing the onset of cold weather, and is followed by a long static overhead shot of suited men advancing slowly amid scattered leafless trees with a zombie-like gait. And of course, the conflation of the two figures, vampires and zombies, is a typical reflection, along with cyborgs, mutants, and aliens, of necro-realist concerns with in-between subjects, or intermediate entities occupying the liminal space at once separating and uniting life and death, for instance. And I'm going to finish very soon with another late Soviet era screen adaptation of the Tolstoy story, and that is, do I need to stop here?
Yeah, we have half an hour to conclude, so if you want to have some conversation exchange.
Do I have 1 minute or 2 minutes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah, it's going to take me maybe 3 minutes max.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a film by Klimov and Shavlak, the Family of the Vourdalaks, 1990. It's a color film, less experimental or radical in format than Yufit's black and white feature, but just as visually stunning. Stunning in particular in its use of overexposure. Although, of course, I could only see the film on a fairly mediocre print, so it's difficult to ascertain. But it looks really, I really want to find a good print of the film. It looks really visually stunning. And also very poetically elusive in its editing. More oniric, more melancholic, even perhaps, than grotesque or absurdist in its treatment, and perhaps that's the difference with the Yufit film. Often the film is often detached from the letter of its source, of the source material, of the original Tolstoy story. Yet, I think, detached from the letter, but yet truly, deeply true to the spirit of the original. And as you know, of course, I mean, it's translation studies now in film scholarship. It's kind of a thing of the past almost, or at least a certain type of, a certain type of, sorry, not translation, although it's the same process, adaptation, adaptational theories and so on and so forth. And as we all know, very often literal adaptations are usually not good, right? So what is really important is for a director, for a filmmaker, for a scriptwriter to really understand the gist, the spirits of the letter Achilles, right? Of the original story, and that's the case with this film. Right? So, and this film generally harkens back to Bava-esque Gothicism, I think, in modern day guises. Again, an autonomous study would be in order to do the film any kind of analytical justice. So we'll here limit myself in conclusion to just a couple of remarks about this particular film, the Klimov and Shavlak, the Family of the Vourdalaks, 1990. A socio-political commentary is not immediately perceptible, even if a late statement by Maria, Soneca's counterpart in the film, like, I quote, "I'm not a master of my destiny, I'm under the influence of some other powers." Okay, that type of statement could, of course, receive an interpretation more collective than individual, more ideological than supernatural in nature. So the ambiguity, the ambivalence is there. When we also think of the start of the film, past the dream prologue, so again, a sort of dream nightmare as for the beginning of the film. So another dream prologue, but in symbolic, almost symbiotic connection with it. If the war photographs taken by Igor being the Marquis Dufay's counterpart in the film. If, it's more like it, yes. If, we have, sorry about the going back and forth. We have war photographs taken by Igor they refer us back to the burial desecration here. You can barely see, but to the left, the character, the bearded character, is desecrating, is opening up a wooden grave. So here, just one grave, and then here, of course, innumerable coffins there, with army helicopters. There's also a state funeral. All that stuff remains unexplained in the film here. The film is in color, but these are photographs, black and white photographs, right? Okay. Okay, it's difficult, and I'm not an expert, I'm not a scholar of Soviet film, so I would like to engage at some point in a conversation with someone who is really an expert. But as we know these days, it's kind of difficult to go to Russia and for Russian scholars to come to Western Europe. So this conversation is not easy there on that side. Although I had a great stream of students in Shanghai last semester from Moscow State University. It was a beautiful paper on more or less related to that kind of material. So I need to get back to her on some of that stuff. But again, that kind of photographs, that kind of unexplained, uncontextualized moments, photos, and so on and so forth, might have been more transparent to Slavic audiences at the time of the film release, and possibly still today. I'm not completely sure. In any case, what I want to mention as well is the emphasis on art, and in particular on religious iconography throughout the film. Again, whose remarkably pictorial visuals further highlight and valorize these religious iconography components. So I think that the emphasis on art, in particular religious iconography, is laced with a political subtext. Okay. So again, I'm treading on thin ice here, but because I'm not a scholar of Soviet Russian cinema, so I might be a little bit off. but I don't think so. So anyway, this film appears to be subtended by, I think, a clandestine, subterranean endurance of faith in the face of evil forces, evil, quote unquote, forces, which, whether supernatural or all too real, right, have resulted, for example, in a nearby church being in a state of utter dereliction, of utter destruction, of ruins. As for resisting faith, it is a contrario emblematized by Maria's small silver-framed icon inherited from her grandmother, and the only relic from the plundered house of God, from this plundered, ruined church. That's the only relic that she has salvaged. So a small silver-framed icon. So well, you have the picture too. But in particular, this medallion, right? So she secretly prays to that silver frame icon, and then she has that medallion to the right that she wears around her neck, depicting in the semblance of the icon a Madonna and child. As a renewed gesture of transmission, said medallion is gifted by Maria to Igor, the Marquis Yufit, right, as he is forced to leave the family. And this medallion will eventually fill the closing frame. And the entire frame is just that medallion at the end, as subsequent to a suspensefully protracted showdown with the family of Wurdalaks, and an equally extended and suspended slow motion fall, Igor eventually suddenly finds himself somehow catapulted from the snow-covered forest environment onto the crowded city pavement of presumably Moscow. And he's holding the medallion in his hand as he comes to, as he, you know, because he had lost consciousness, right? It is arguably a moot point whether the object is a relic from the past, an heirloom as was the case with the grand maternal icon. So whether the object is a relic from the past or from some other space-time continuum, as if it belonged to a dream or fantasy world. One final comment by way of circling back to the guiding thread of the family unit. Deviating not only from the original novella, but from all of the other screen adaptations, the Wurdalakization of the entire family in the Klimov and Shavlak film occurs, or at least is presented as occurring, 3 points. One, sometime after the protagonist's eviction or departure from the area. After, not during. It is presented as occurring too in an enigmatic or equivocal editing style. There's a prolonged hiatus, a cut to black, following Igor's intense gaze at a painting portrait. And so that equivocal editing style calls into question the nature of what follows. What follows? Is it a reminiscence? Is it an open-eye dream? Is it a vision or a premonition, all pictorially induced? We don't know. And then the Wurdalakization is presented as occurring, third and last point, in the form of condensed or elliptical concatenation. We have the mother giving in to her returning son's pleas outside and opening the door. You remember that? As in Bava. So this would be, you can barely see, but this would be to the left. No, and to the right as well. So we have the child to the left, and then you see the mother just about to open the door to the right, right? Okay. So we have that, and then we cut to husband and wife. Sort of, we're very exposed to it. It's almost like black and white here. Huh? And again, the imagery almost of the shroud, sort of mummification, right, of the bodies. Okay. So we have husband and wife lying side by side on the white sheets of their death-like bed, until the wife to the right hand side here slowly, but unexpectedly, rolls over to pray on her spouse here to the right hand side. And then another moment followed here where we have the husband now biting the brother's neck amid the Martian, snow-covered reeds. So in closing, I think I will leave it to you to decide whether in this last film, the emphasis on the collapse of religion and the family via a return to the Russian Empire era of Tolstoy's story and life might not be construed, not unlike perhaps Adrien Beau's version implicitly pointing us in the direction of the end of French monarchy in its coda. So maybe the emphasis on the collapse of religion and the family via return to the Russian Empire era of Tolstoy's story in this last film could be construed as a harbinger, as a premonition, conscious or unconscious, of the breakdown of the USSR, which was to come barely a year later. Thank you for your attention.